Bon matin et merci d'être ici avec
Good
nous.
morning, and thank you for being here with us today. I am Tyler McCann, Director General of the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. Before we begin today's discussion, I would like to acknowledge that I'm joining you from Western Quebec, the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe Nation. We should all recognize and think about the Indigenous peoples who were the first inhabitants of
CAPI
our
is pleased to
territories.
host today's exploration of externalities and their impact on policy. As part of our mission to undertake strategic and policy analysis on issues impacting Canadian agriculture and food, engage stakeholders in dialogue, and advance public policy, we will review the foundations that underpin externalities and discuss their place in agriculture policy today. CAPI cannot deliver on its mission on its own. We rely on knowledge and financial partners to make our work possible. Please reach out to me or Bree, our Director of Partnerships and Business Development, to talk about how you can become a CAPI partner. In the past, CAPI relied extensively on Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada funding, a relationship that is changing. As part of our obligations under the previous funding agreement, we need your input to complete a compulsory performance evaluation. Please take a couple of minutes to fill out this short survey on the work CAPI has done over the past 2 years. We appreciate your support and input. CAPI first released a report on externalities in 2020, written by academics at the University of Guelph and Saskatoon, including Professor Tristan Skolrud. The report used available information to measure both the positive and negative externalities arising from Canadian agriculture. The report highlighted how negative externalities have declined significantly since 1981. Recently, CAPI published a quick think report written by our very own Margaret Zafiriou, who we will hear from today. The report links externalities in agriculture to current issues in ag policy, including the agreement on the next ag policy framework announced by governments in July. This morning, we will hear from Margaret, and then our panelists will join in for a discussion. Please feel free to submit questions at any time using Zoom's Q&A function. I will ask as many questions as possible during our discussion. Margaret Zafiriou has been a research associate at the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute since 2018. She is an economist who has worked in agriculture and agri-food policy research in both government and industry, including stints at the Conference Board, Finance Canada, and Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, before consulting with the Dairy Processors Association, Statistics Canada, and here at CAPI. Her areas of expertise include analysis of agriculture and the food system in Canada, as well as innovation, trade, and environmental policy. Margaret, we look forward to hearing from you. Over to you.
Thank you, Tyler, for your kind introduction, and welcome everyone. Bienvenue à tous. I'm here today, along with my esteemed colleagues, to talk about externalities in the context of Canadian agriculture and the policies and initiatives that are being put in place to address them. This draws on some of the research CAPI has done recently that Tyler just mentioned. Can I have the presentation, please? And move to the second. There. Thank you very much. First things first, what are externalities? My apologies if this harks you back to your Economics 101 class in college, which may still give you nightmares. I know sometimes it does for me. Externalities in agriculture occur when there are societal costs or benefits arising from an individual farmer's production decisions, which are not priced through normal market mechanisms and hence are usually not factored into their decision-making. In other words, they are not internalized. Without proper price signals, which are normally provided through markets, these externalities are either overproduced, such as in the case of harmful air or water pollution, or underproduced, as in the case of wildlife habitat from grazing lands or carbon sequestration. This leads to market failure and is a justification for government intervention, especially when there are public good aspects to them. Sometimes we refer to these as environmental or ecological goods and services, EG&S. So you might hear me refer to that. Next slide. Here's an example of some of the externalities from Canadian agriculture. These are greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, we're all familiar with these numbers. These data are from Environment and Climate Change Canada's National Inventory Report from 2022. They show how greenhouse gas emissions in Canadian agriculture have increased more recently to reach 55 megatons CO2 equivalent in 2020. This was primarily due to higher emissions from crop production, whereas emissions from animal production and on-farm energy use have stabilized. Soil carbon sinks, which are reported elsewhere in the National Inventory Report in land use change, sequestered 9.5 megatons of CO2 in 2020. And this was primarily the result of best management practices such as no-till and cover cropping and other efforts that have led to more carbon being sequestered in the soil in 2020 as a credit. Next slide. So why is it important to be able to value? Next slide. Why is it important to be able to value externalities? Given that externalities are not normally priced, it's important to be able to value them, because by putting a value on externalities allows producers to internalize them. By doing so, they will be motivated to adjust their behavior to take account of the costs or the benefits from their decisions. Valuing externalities can also help consumers understand the nature of the externality and quantify their willingness to pay for it, so that they can demonstrate their preference for the externality being addressed. Valuing externalities is also important for governments because it can help justify the need for policy intervention. It can help governments prioritize which areas to target. It can help identify whether the cost of the intervention is greater than the benefit, which is an important consideration in program design. It can also help governments determine how best to intervene. In other words, whether to use a carrot or a stick approach. Carrot approaches refer to initiatives that provide incentives rather than penalties. Regulations, taxation, and zoning restrictions are considered stick approaches, whereas subsidies, grants, research investments that lead to knowledge that is transmitted to producers are considered carrot approaches. In the end, putting a value on externalities can also help government evaluate how effective their programs are that are targeting those externalities. Next slide, please. So why is there a role for government in addressing externalities? I mentioned it a little bit above, because without markets to price externalities, they're not taken into account, and the resulting costs and benefits impact others in society based on the spillovers into other jurisdictions. Many of these have public good aspect. Examples are air or water quality, because you can't exclude anyone from them. The competitive marketplace and policy environment in which farmers operate offer low returns and high risks, thereby discouraging them from adopting often more sustainable production practices at a cost to them, while society may benefit. Would you like to pay for something that others benefit from? Many farmers, especially those who consider stewardship important, would argue that they already do internalize some of these externalities. This is especially the case if they adopt BMPs that save them money or lead to higher revenues. No-till is a perfect example, since it led to significant labor and energy cost savings for farmers at the same time that it improved soil health. But by adopting BMPs that reduce environmental impacts, producers to some extent already have internalized some of these externalities. Government can provide incentives for producers to adopt them, thereby addressing externalities. However, the need to understand farmers' behavior relative to risk, their willingness to adopt, their willingness to invest in new technologies and knowledge, as well as the financial means to do so. But even once you know that government has a role, there's still questions around what is the best approach. As I say, do we use the carrot or the stick? And how best do we design those programs that can address externalities? And how do we know if the programs were effective, if they delivered on their outcomes? Next slide, please. So these are all questions that CAPI had in mind when it launched its research program addressing externalities in Canadian agriculture. Over the past few years, some of this research has focused on externalities. CAPI held a series of workshops and published a series of papers on externalities. This began with the research we did on clean growth in agriculture for the Clean Prosperity Institute, published in 2019, authored by Yildirim et al. Then we held 2 workshops in Guelph and Calgary that were well attended, focused on optimizing land use for sustainable growth in 2019. There were many presentations and reports that came out of these events, and they were published on CAPI's website by Vox and Cooten, Skolrud et al., Smuckler, Carlisle, dealing with some of these externalities. Then we commissioned Skolrud and a series of and colleagues, Ken Belcher, Lloyd Smith, Slade, Weersink, Abayatea, and Prescott, to produce that report on measuring externalities in Canadian agriculture. And as Tyler has mentioned, this has been one of the most popular publications that has been downloaded from CAPI's website. So because Tyler likes to communicate in different ways through our publications and research, we produced a quick think report that tried to put the results of some of this research in an easier, shorter, more easy to understand format. And that was what was recently published just this month. Next slide, please. This table here shows the results of some of the estimates that Skolrud and his colleagues put together for valuing both positive and negative externalities in Canadian agriculture. As Tyler mentioned, it was based on data that was from 1981 to 2011, so it appears to be somewhat dated, but it does tell us an interesting story that hadn't been done up to this time. So for example, based on the value of GHG emission reductions, there was improvement over this period. Also significant improvement in the reduction in soil erosion, as valued in these estimates, as you can see. Skolrud et al. Also just didn't do Canada, but they also did the provincial regions. So for example, they did the Prairie provinces and Ontario and Quebec. And what we can see is that there are quite a bit of difference in the regions, which is really important, because what it tells us is that regional impacts are very different. And so it leads to different policy and solutions. And so based on the total, so they estimated negative externalities and the value of positive, and the result was the total net externalities were valued at 4.3 billion in 2011, which was a slight improvement over that longer period from 1981. Next slide, please. Given that it was somewhat dated data, we were made aware of some indicators that had come out of Environment Canada that show us about the state of ammonia emissions, another externality from Canadian agriculture. And as we can see from this particular slide, which goes right up to 2020, ammonia emissions from agriculture have increased by 24% since 1990. And while there was a slight dip in 2010, around 2010, they are on their way up again. So looking at more recent data, we can see that there is still improvement to be made in addressing externalities in Canada. Next slide, please. So some of the things that we learned from Skolrud results, we learned that valuing externalities is very data intensive, and also the data is unavailable or dated. Externalities differ substantially across provinces and by externality type. Hence, localized solutions are best. More research is needed in this area to both be able to estimate values and make use of more accurate methodologies that reflect Canada and regional characteristics. We also learned that, again, there is an important role for government in helping address externalities and value them, because it helps in the design, delivery, and effectiveness of policies and programs. Next slide, please. So what is government currently doing to address agriculture externalities? We know that we've seen the Environment and Climate Change Canada has allocated $4 billion to the Nature Smart Climate Solutions Fund, which addresses emissions from grasslands, wetlands, peatlands, and also to conserve and to promote biodiversity. Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, of course, have their programs, the Agriculture Climate Solutions Program focused on BMP adoption, with $200 million that was originally allocated to this On-Farm Climate Action Fund, and $185 million to the Living Labs program, which have subsequently been reinforced in budget 2022. There's also funding for scientific research that focuses on mitigation and adaptation. And of course, as Tyler mentioned, in July 2022, we saw FPT Ministers of Agriculture sign a 5-year agreement called the Sustainable Canadian Agriculture Partnership, which will commit to the future sustainability, resilience, and vitality of the Canadian agriculture and agri-food sector, with a commitment of $3.5 billion over 5 years. In this program, we already know that there is a new program that will be rewarding environmental goods and services of $250 million. And we also understand that AAFC is currently consulting on a green agricultural plan. And no doubt there will be further programs and initiatives to try and respond to externalities from Canadian agriculture. And we hope that this spending will be sufficient and also effective. Next slide, please. There's also other measures, not just by government, that can be done to address externalities. So for example, we've seen the development of carbon markets, because what they do is they develop a price mechanism, a value for that externality. We also have seen water credit markets, and increasingly as well, there's demand for sustainably produced products from downstream buyers. These, of course, require standards, certification, and verification protocols that will create trust so that consumers believe in the sustainability certification. The Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef is working very closely with McDonald's in this area. Finally, voluntary initiatives are available that raise private sector funds to pay for EG&S. We have, of course, with us Bryan Gilvesy, who will talk about ALUS, but there's also other initiatives, including Ducks Unlimited, Nature Conservancy, and watershed associations across the country. Next slide, please. So just based on this research, based on the work that CAPI's done, here are some of the challenges that we've identified in addressing externalities through policies programs. So for one, which policy approach is most effective, carrot or stick, or maybe both? There are data and measurement issues related to the costs and benefits, which need to be collected in order to be able to value those externalities. In agriculture, of course, we have to understand the motivation for adoption, why or why not they're being adopted by producers. And given the voluntary participation in many of the programs, it's very difficult to predict or to measure the outcomes. There's also the question of additionality. Why should you subsidize when the producer was going to do it anyway? That's a major issue in designing programs and policies to address externalities? And finally, how do you evaluate the effectiveness of these policies and programs, given the difficulty valuing externalities? More effort, more resources, investment in data, investment in research, because of the science and knowledge that's required in order to undertake this sort of analysis that Skolrud and his colleagues have done. So I'm hoping that the panel discussion that follows will answer some of these questions. I'm really looking forward to hearing from colleagues and also from the questions and answers that take place in the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Margaret, and look forward to turning now to the panel discussion, where we'll really get at picking up some of those challenges that you just talked about. So at any time, please feel free, the audience, to include questions using the Q&A function within Zoom. Again, I've got some questions that will start off our panel discussion, but then we'll certainly be taking as many questions as we can from the audience. So to kick off our panel discussion, I'm going to introduce each panelist individually and then ask them a question, and then we'll go to an open discussion with the panelists and Margaret. I'm going to start this morning with Tristan Skolrud. He is an associate professor in the Department of Agriculture and Resource Economics at the University of Saskatchewan. His research focuses on the intersection between farm-level decision-making and agro-environmental policy. He is an expert in agricultural greenhouse gas mitigation policy, speaking frequently at government and trade events across Canada. Tristan was born and raised in Washington State and received a PhD in economics from Washington State University in 2015 and an MA in economics from the University of Washington in 2011. Tristan, you were involved in writing this 2020 report that Margaret highlighted. As she mentioned, it's been one of the more popular reports that CAPI's produced. It talked about the progress that agriculture's made in reducing its negative externalities, but it talked about spent quite a bit of time talking about the challenges that come with trying to actually put a value on them, to measure them in a country as large and as diverse as Canada. Went further to talk about some of the limitations that people should be keeping in mind, including being a number of externalities where we don't really have appropriate biophysical data to do that measurement, to quantify those impacts. That there are these gaps and uncertainties that exist with agriculture's impact on the environment and human health, and really just with these limitations with methods that are used to try and put a value on them. So with all of that in mind, I would like to start with you around how do you manage these limitations when we're trying to put a value on externalities, and how did the limitations impact how externalities can or should be used to inform policy development?
Well, thanks for the question very much, Tyler, and thanks for having me. I'm really happy to be here this morning. The questions you raise are excellent questions, especially with agriculture. And one of the main reasons why we have such difficulty in this space is because most of the negative environmental externalities from agriculture are what we call non-point source, which means that it's very, very difficult to say this farm contributed this much to this particular negative externality. And when we can't do that, we're left with models and algorithms and trying to extend data from research trials or small scale measurements to say, okay, if we have this connection between a method and a measurement here, what does that look like in this area that we can't afford to measure? Greenhouse gas emissions are an excellent example of this. All of the data that we see about agricultural greenhouse gas emissions, that's modeled data. We take information on weather, soil quality, what types of farm characteristics are available, what types of information about farm methodology is available, and we say, okay, if all these things are happening, then this is what we expect emissions to be. And as you can imagine, it's very, very difficult, and it's hard to convince the public that that's a prudent way to think about coming up with incentives, if the best we can do is modeling instead of measuring at a finer resolution. And with respect to the valuation of externalities, important thing to remember is that there's two key pieces of information for each externality. There's the physical measurement, and then there's the actual valuation. Each one of those has problems. I've talked about the physical measurements, but the actual valuation measurements are equally problematic because it sort of relies on surveys and other means to say, okay, how does this negative thing affect you? Or might rely on a health study that says, okay, well, this is the total health impact from situations where we have particulate matter above this threshold. And all of those things have a large degree of uncertainty that's very important and difficult to account for when setting the appropriate policy.
You know, that large degree of uncertainty that you just talked about, how much of a barrier is that uncertainty to using externalities, to putting a value on them when coming up with policy solutions? Is that a reason not to use them, or are there tools or approaches that we can use to mitigate that?
It's not necessarily a reason not to use them at all. But usually what happens in non-point source pollution problems is that we say, okay, if a farmer or someone else that is, that's generating some of these negative externalities adopts some sort of practice to mitigate them, then what we might say is that, okay, they're not going to mitigate perfectly. It's going to be something like 80% based on this sort of range of uncertainty. And as you can imagine, people get very upset about that because they say, okay, well, I've taken the work to do all these things, and then you're just going to kind of use a model to say what you think is going to happen based on what I've done. And it's very dissatisfying for a lot of reasons. Another way to get around this problem is to try and make measurements more towards the source. So even if you can't identify individual sources, you might be able to identify, say, a body of water that a whole group of farmers contribute to polluting in some capacity, right? So you might take information about how pollutants change in that water body and then make policy based on that. But it's very tricky at best.
And is all data created equally? Like, how is this data landscape changing, and is it becoming easier or harder as the amount of data becomes available?
Yeah, absolutely. Data is definitely not created equally. In our study, one of the things we had to do is we had to rely on valuations from other parts of the world. When you start talking about valuing things like particulate matter, it's not like there's a study that says this was the damage that particulate matter did in each one of the provinces, right? So we have to take studies that say, in this area that has these characteristics, this was the damage of particulate matter. And then we have to transfer that benefit to the areas that we're looking at. And the closer the data is in that initial experiment to the places that you're actually trying to make policy for, the better. And that's one of the nicer things about increasing the amount of data, is that we can get closer to a more accurate representation of that. But to some extent, the fact that these externalities are non-point source, that's never going to go away. We're not really expecting that we're going to get into this place where we have on-farm measurement of all of these things. So modeling, for better or for worse, is going to continue to be a part of this problem for a long time.
Great. Thank you, Tristan. So we're going to go to our next panelist. We'll come back to you at the end with some follow-up questions, but I'd like to now go to Bryan Gilvesy. So Tristan looks at this from the University of Saskatchewan. Bryan is looking at this from Southern Ontario, where he is on the front line, not only as a rancher, but as someone that's running a program rewarding producers. So Bryan Gilvesy is the CEO of ALUS Canada. ALUS is a national community-led farmer-delivered charitable program that rewards farmers to produce more ecosystem services and develops market values for those services. Bryan is also the owner of YU Ranch, a sustainable grass-based ranching operation in Norfolk County in Southern Ontario. Bryan serves as an executive in residence for agriculture and sustainability at the Ivey School of Business at Western University. He also received numerous awards for his environmental excellence and stewardship, including the Ontario Premier's Award for Ag Innovation and the Canadian Farmer Rancher Pollinator Award. Bryan, as I said a minute ago, the issue of externalities is not an academic one. It is one that impacts producers, it impacts Canadians, it impacts the environment. And it's, you as a rancher are already managing your cows in ways that takes a potential negative impact, a negative externality, and turns it into a positive one. And then as CEO of ALUS, you're delivering these programs that pay farmers for this service that they're providing, that pay farmers for their positive externalities. I'd like to start by asking you to talk about, how exactly does ALUS go about valuing these positive services that farmers are providing? And could you then talk about your experience getting governments, the private sector, philanthropic organizations to actually pay for those services?
Thank you, Tyler, and I'm very pleased to be here this morning. Determining value is a complex problem, and so we come at it from 4 different directions. I'd like to think of it like building a brick wall, where every piece of evidence we can unearth helps build that wall and helps us steam towards a direction. But I will say this, that brick wall has to continue to be built over time, and we'll get better at this. But let's begin here. The first element is this. Our program is delivered through partnership advisory committees across the country, which are made up of 50% farmers. They can approach the problem or give us advice from a cost basis. What does it cost to actually do the programming? What is involved for the farmer in the management and maintenance? Land rental rates gives us some rudimentary estimates of what the land value of worth that they're contributing. But beginning by understanding what it costs to produce something is a pretty good place to begin. You layer over top of that the predictive nature of some of the science that's gone before us and some of the theory that exists. I mean, there are wonderful documents like the federal document that calculates the value of nature to Canadians. We've had lovely interactions with Nancy Olaweiler, for instance, over the years, and Tristan's work, of course, is seminal in this place. So you've got some predictive theory in this space coming from many different scientific and academic directions. The next level is then to try and assess the productivity of this work. And that's done through research. Researching on ALUS projects is a very, very wonderful place to do because there's always a before and an after. So that's very attractive to researchers that come into our space. So we begin with 3 researchers from University of Guelph, the McCann Lab, the Frixell Lab, and the McDougall Lab. Together, they're working on studies on, for instance, biodiversity benefits of our project sites. They've done studies on bats, fish, birds, beneficial insects, and pollinator increases on our project sites. They've done research on water quality and nutrient reduction that occurs from the plants that we use for our nature-based solutions. And of course, there's some measurement of carbon sequestration by literally putting probes in the ground on demonstration farms of our ALUS sites. You layer over top of that the seminal work from Dr. Wenhong Yang. He's also at University of Guelph with his IAM-WEBS platform. We've collaborated with Dr. Yang on 4 watersheds across Canada for his IAM-WEBS platform, which is a predictive tool that can begin to estimate the ecosystem service value of our project sites on different watersheds. This is exciting work because Dr. Yang has the best data sets in Canada on watershed performance and hydrology and these sorts of things. Finally, in the research side, our own Mary Ellen Anderson, who's come to us from Microsoft, she's leading a team of terrestrial carbon experts and tech leaders to quantify carbon across the country on our project sites. Lastly, then, the final element in all this is things are only worth what people will pay you for it. So we have an ongoing, I call it a price discovery project, but letting the market speak is very valuable here. That's probably the ultimate arbiter of what things are worth or what things are valued as. And one thing is clear as we continue price discovery with our partners, and that is we've received really strong signals that carbon derived from terrestrial sources, carbon that has biodiversity, water quality, community benefits, social benefits, all these other things attached through a community-based program like ours that values a complete suite of ecosystem services. That terrestrial carbon is worth more money than regular carbon, if so to speak. So if you compared the carbon from let's say the methane capture on a garbage site, for instance, that gives you a one-dimensional aspect. If they were to invest and their priority was in carbon through ALUS, they're willing to reward more because of the co-benefits that come with it. And we cannot sleep on the fact that It's really important because of the nature of our program that we've unearthed a clear understanding that community and social impacts matter in this space. I know it's not pure EG&S theory, but it does matter to what people are willing to pay. So you put all those elements together, you consider yourself building a wall, and you consider the wall's never fully built, but you're better at it every day. And that's the approach we take. Our science will continue marching on with our work. Now, as far as bringing acceptance into our work, everybody seems to have played their role perfectly in this. Beginning with our program began with an idea from Ian Wishart, who was a potato farmer in Manitoba and who's now a MLA in there for Minister of Education, I believe. That idea was picked up largely by the philanthropic community. The philanthropic community is in the business of stimulating and funding and generating great ideas. The philanthropic community helped us provide proof of concept and also to build the systems, the databases, the methodologies, the handbooks, the guidebooks, our overall principles that support a program that we called the Farmers Conservation Plan. So the philanthropic community played their role perfectly, but at the same time, they asked us consistently, on the other side, if we're correct on this theory that ecosystem services matter and that farmers that produce them matter, they want us to get to that final arbiter, to find market or sustainable revenues. So then the obvious choice then is to speak to the government, which is the next obvious line. We all turn to governments for when we have these conversations. And I'm proud to say that we delivered on many federal and provincial priorities from an environmental standpoint with our project sites. For example, biodiversity, delivery of biodiversity habitat is a big piece for federal, provincial governments. Clean water or water quality of the Great Lakes and Lake Winnipeg Basin, for instance, are priorities we've delivered upon, among others. We do want to grow our relationships with federal and provincial governments to a deeper understanding of the nature-based solutions that we can provide for them under the different programmatic things that they're considering. But the breakthrough for us, the breakthrough has been at municipal government level. It's no mistake that in Alberta, for instance, all 18 of our partners are municipal governments. And you have to ask yourself, why are they interested in impacting the natural landscape in their communities through nature-based solutions that provided by the people of the land, the people of that community? And it can be sometimes a very complex thing, such as community may voice the desire to be a more livable community, or something so simple as this, that they want to build in landscape resilience so that the extreme weather events they're wiping out culverts and bridges and roads and causing them to have uncontained cost to their infrastructure, their built infrastructure. It's a matter of gaining control of those costs by using natural infrastructure, right? The project sites that our farmers can deliver. I think that's kind of the first most exciting breakthrough to see that, councils across Canada are making decisions like this, that natural infrastructure matters to them and they're willing to put their money where their mouth is. Lastly, corporate participation is something we've seen before. And ultimately, of course, we want to be able to build a model that allows individuals to come in. But corporate participation in our programs indicates there's a growing market demand for ecosystem service. We believe this demand is being driven by 4 major catalysts: climate change, net zero emission goals, water quality and quantity issues, biodiversity loss, and maybe more specifically, ESG reporting, environmental, social, and governance reporting that they're increasingly having to do to satisfy their investors, and also to gain the trust of the public in their social license to operate. Collectively, these drivers represent a market energy that can provide significant funding for farmers working towards ecosystem service delivery through our community-based program. At ALUS, we're delivering this marketplace with a corporate vehicle we call the New Acre Project. It connects sponsoring corporations to the beneficial outcomes that our farmers produce on the landscape. The New Acre project is unique because in a marketplace for single dimensional items like carbon sequestration, it represents for the full suite of benefits that we derive from nature-based solutions delivered by farmers on farmland. ALUS will continue to underpin the value of the New Acre through the existing research, but also through high quality verifiable carbon credit claims that both protect the farmer's privacy and data, yet deliver a high quality value to the emerging marketplace. So what you see emerging here is something that's unique in this world. We think we're valuing, we're providing tremendous value to the farm gate for the efforts of those people that roll up their sleeves and take action. We're also maximizing value delivered to the marketplace, and very little gets lost in the middle. We're almost a frictionless system. It's not built on greenwashing. It's built on shared value. And in these days where we tend to think of the world as a zero-sum game, I have to say, like, I'm proud of the fact that it's so refreshing to think that we can do both things at the same time.
You know, Bryan, part of the doing both things at the same time is that you're actually doing, when you say both, you're actually doing a lot of things at the same time, right? You talked about the benefits to producers. You know, I think often when people used to think about ALUS, you think about the benefits of watercourse and watercourse protection, but you're talking about the community benefits. You've talked about the benefits of municipality for protecting infrastructure. I want to go back to something you said at the beginning about how the benefits for that terrestrial, GHG emission is worth more than municipal waste because of all of these co-benefits that are here. Just wondering, if you think about how the attitude around sustainability would have changed since 2006 when ALUS was launched, how much of that change comes from the fact that we have a better understanding of what those co-benefits are? And I would probably venture a guess that producers have probably always kind of understood the co-benefits, and probably understood that this isn't just about GHG, but this is about a lot of things happening all at the same time. But how much of getting that traction really comes from being able to say, this isn't just about carbon emission, this is about carbon emissions and biodiversity and water protection?
Well, let me first speak from a farmer's perspective, because back in 2006, when I became, I think, the third demonstration farmer in the system, when ALUS was just a concept, I remember day one. I felt very much outside the conversation. And this program offered me an opportunity to be inside the conversation and to contribute to providing solutions to the world's greater problems while not impacting the productivity of my farm. That's a really important concept, that my farm becomes a multifunctional place, right? And I can also provide for another market while providing food and fiber for Canadians and feeding the 9 billion people we have to. That in itself is a very rewarding concept, right? But confirming for everyone out there that there's an opportunity here, and that the opportunity is very big, takes time. And again, if you go through the ladder or the way change has occurred, the change began with leadership at farm level by some people that had some really good ideas. We began supported by the philanthropic community that helped advance the conversation. You bring in more research and more layers. We reach more people. We finally have a communication staff. But it's about recognizing an opportunity, not about beating people over the head. And I think that's what makes this time we're at, the moment we're in, I think it's exciting. I just think it's we're at a really neat place in time for this stuff. And as Margaret started with her presentation, there is some government money beginning to recognize this, and that's maybe evidence that, yeah, maybe we were right a long time ago, or maybe Ian was right a long time ago.
Great. Well, thanks, Bryan. And so I'm going to switch now to Jan to pick up that point on government, and because I think it's interesting to look at, again, if you talk about the change in the marketplace for ALUS since 2006, the change in the public policy environment has been pretty considerable too. And so Jan comes to us with experience working in policy and economic research for over 30 years. Inside government, outside of government, she's been the Director of Government Relations for the Canadian Canola Growers Association. Inside government, she was the Director General of Sustainability at Environment, what was at that time Environment Canada, now Environment and Climate Change Canada. She brought into force the first federal sustainable development strategy. At Agriculture Canada, she was Director General of the Research and Analysis Division, and provided evidence-based advice for policy and programs, including BRM programs, environmental analysis, commodity forecasting for Canada, and the OECD FAO Outlook, farm income and ag, and information around agriculture and agri-food contributions to Canada's economy. You know, Jan, just a minute ago, I talked about the work that you were doing, providing evidence-based advice for policy and programs. You know, we've talked a lot about that already with Tristan and with Bryan, but you know, I'd like to get your take on what role putting that value on externalities, that either positive or negative value, plays in government policymaking. Do we have enough information today to really allow for that meaningful evidence-based policymaking when it comes to agriculture's impact on the environment, and what do governments do when they can't put that value one way or the other on an externality? So probably lots in there, but interested in your take on that.
Thanks, Tyler. Happy to participate in this discussion. I think I'm going to start by saying that in terms of the discussion about, you know, what are the right measurements and what are the right instruments for ag policy, I think we've demonstrated over the presentation and things that people have said that there are many ways to achieve your policy or program goals in government. And one of the roles of government in this process is to bring all evidence that you have currently to the discussion in question. There are formal mechanisms for doing this. For example, any regulatory measure that comes into place has to have a regulatory impact assessment. And valuing externalities will be a big part of that in terms of benefit cost analysis. There are also any program or policy that is put in place by government has to have a strategic environmental assessment. So to your question about do we have enough information? Well, economists would probably say we never have quite enough, but we certainly have much better information now than we did when we started down this road 20 years ago with the first agriculture policy framework. So data has improved. People have been studying it. Evidence such as the reports that have been commissioned by CAPI and what Tristan talked to us about today feed into all of that government decision making. So Margaret referred to the fact that the next policy framework is now under consultation. That's a process that is extremely important for getting this information gathered together so that government can synthesize what they know to date and then send it out for consultation to the various groups that will be required to respond to those policy initiatives or discussions about where policy might go. So it's an iterative process. All information like this feeds into that process, and the further along we get, the more we refine it. Bryan was quite right. You know, when we started years ago, we didn't have the depth of information that we once had. And every time we do this, it gets a little bit better.
You know, one of the outcomes of that policy process, Jan, is that governments decide at the end of the day whether or not they want to use, you know, incentives, positive reinforcements to get either decrease a negative or increase a positive, or to use the, you know, the proverbial stick, to use regulations, licensing, other tools that they have to try and get the opposite outcomes. So, you know, can you speak to what that process looks like, some of the ways that things that government is thinking about when it thinks about whether or not, you know, it should use the carrot or the stick to address these issues?
Well, I think most of our panelists have already alluded to the fact that, every measure and every region and every problem has a different solution. So the consultation mechanisms that are in place for establishing any government policy are pretty rigorous. The agriculture policy framework is an example. So, bureaucrats and government officials synthesize information that they have, they put out a discussion document, and then they ask for feedback. Industry groups, individuals feed into that process with their own analysis, with their own views, and it's an iterative process coming forward with options for what might work best in a particular situation, given a goal. Right now, one of the goals of agriculture policy on the environment is clearly to reduce greenhouse gases. So there's a discussion paper out right now on the fertilizer use and the emissions that are being seen from the agriculture industry. So that discussion document is the beginning of sorting through which instrument to use. When you get further down the road, then you have more targeted instruments like the RIAS, as they're called, regulatory impact assessments, that require you to put on the table options, alternatives, benefit cost analysis, and all of the work that is done with respect to economic analysis, alternatives, goes into documents like that. The same thing for strategic and environmental assessments. So those are formal processes that happen after a consultation process and continue on throughout the discussion until a final decision is made. So it's a very iterative process. Nobody starts out saying this is going to be a regulatory approach, or this is going to be an incentive or a subsidy, or this is going to be a change in the way we deliver some of our bigger programs like business risk management. All of those options and alternatives get discussed in that process.
And Jen, one of the questions we've got from the audience points out that, when it comes to the question of carrots or sticks, it's also not an either or approach, no. Right? Often what you see when governments are trying to tackle a policy issue is they'll use a blend of instruments. I'm going to bring in the other panelists on this too now, but I'll stick with you first on this. When you look at the effectiveness of the policy tools that we have around carrots or sticks or some combination thereof, I was wondering if you just speak to kind of how you see the effectiveness of the different tools and when one gets used over the other.
Oh, that's a big question. I don't have a clear, perfect answer for this. I think what happens is that policies, programs, regulatory approaches get refined over time. You might, in some circumstances, choose a regulatory approach. My best example of that right now is like the species at risk legislation. They're listing species and they're determining their classification in terms of protected or endangered species. That's a purely regulatory approach, given that the legislation for the Species at Risk Act demands that they be listed in some categories. So that's a purely legislative driven approach to listing species. At the other end of the spectrum, you have programs like ALUS, which are very incentive based and have determined that the best way to pay for the environmental goods and services that are provided by ALUS is an incentive-based program, and that program has also developed over time. So it really very much depends on what your what you're trying to achieve, and the effectiveness is usually determined over time with program evaluation, and refinements are made. So there's no clear answer to any one instrument. You just have to continue to bring evidence to the table about what works and what doesn't.
Right, and so part of bringing that evidence to the table comes from the work that happens in academia. Let's go back to
Yes.
Tristan. So Tristan, your thoughts on this question around, again, we use the colloquial carrot and stick, but the kind of the negative or positive reinforcements from a policy perspective.
Yeah, it's it's a really good question. It's something that I was just speaking with a respondent in the Q&A feature about, and I would say from the academic perspective, the way we think about carrots and sticks has a little bit to do with the severity of the externality. Okay, so for example, if we take a step outside of agriculture for a moment and think about some of the other things in our, not so recent past that have caused negative effects, things like sulfur dioxide and acid rain, things like using lead in manufacturing, things like using asbestos in manufacturing. I think that the general consensus there is, okay, well, it doesn't make sense to use carrots in that approach. We have verifiable public health information that says all of these things are bad. We need to stop it right now. So the stick had widespread support, probably not as much from people in the affected industries, but they knew that it was a necessary thing to happen. We're in a position now when we're talking about agriculture that none of the, and I'm, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, other panelists, but none of the negative externalities from agriculture are at the same level in the public's perception that some of these other issues are, especially with respect to the difference between local effects and global effects. I would say that people understand for the most part that global warming and GHG emissions are probably society's biggest problem, but they also don't have in Canada especially, a big local effect on the ground where the average member of the public says, okay, if I stop driving as much, this is going to have an effect on climate variability here. And when you divorce that sort of cause and effect, it makes it very, very hard to gather widespread support for a stick because the public doesn't see the necessity as much as the case where you have very, very damaging, well understood externalities. So that's one of the reasons that we suspect that in agriculture in particular, that the carrot approach is definitely more prevalent, along with some of the not unimportant political considerations.
But Tristan, as you mentioned, and so I'm going to go to Bryan with this question. You made the point that it's when we realize how severe things are that the government will go to a more regulatory approach. And but in advance of that, right, one of the things that we can do in agriculture is get ahead of the issue, right? Develop a proactive plan where governments, the public may be more willing to use incentives to pay for those services. Bryan, it's interesting, again, in 2006, when ALUS was getting up and running, you were out ahead of the issue. I'm wondering, if you look at how you see the public policy debate playing out around ag and the environment and the consequences today, how much opportunity is there, do you think, to continue to get out ahead of it, to use positive programs like ALUS that provide an incentive to producers to avoid hopefully getting to the point where governments are saying it is severe, to use Tristan's words, we need to use a regulatory approach or we need to prohibit instead. How do you see that dynamic playing out?
So I want to begin by saying that let's not assume that we're absent sticks in the business now. We have nutrient management plans here in Ontario. My county has the tree cutting bylaw. We certainly have to farm differently around a wellhead. There's wellhead protection legislation. There's species at risk legislation. There are many, many layers of regulation legislation that apply to the farm that provide those boundaries for the most extreme things, as Tristan has mentioned. I stand for the opportunity. Can you imagine if we became the country where we harnessed the power of this machine, this agricultural machine, to both feed the planet and solve its world's greatest environmental problems. It's a marvelous opportunity. I think the Canadian agriculture is very well positioned to do this. We interact with a lot of farmers, farmers and ranchers across the country, one-on-one. We think they're ready. We think this industry is ready to take a bigger role. And in some ways, stewardship, we're all farmers because stewardship is in our blood. So I think we're just harnessing something that's already there.
Well, and on the topic of opportunities, right? One of the interesting dynamics that's changing around the world is this push to renewable diesel, moving past the initial phase of biofuels policy, and so bring Jen in on this in a minute. But we're seeing this opportunity where we've got, for example, Canadian canola. It's got a very low carbon intensity. It's a more valuable product in the marketplace in Europe, where it's got a higher value because it can be blended against other feedstocks that have a lower carbon intensity. We've seen recently over the last 6 months in Canada this kind of blow up around fertilizer policy and the government's efforts to drive down emissions from fertilizer. But at the same time, doing that actually would be more valuable for farmers and better positioned Canadian canola in the European biodiesel market, for example. So I use that as an example where I think that there are these opportunities that exist around the world, but I think we lost track of them in a debate that got blown out of proportion, and while I think there are some good reasons to be concerned, probably missed the mark in a lot of ways. I was wondering, Bryan, if you could just comment around how you see this broader dialogue around opportunities versus challenges when it comes to using policies to influence externalities.
I like this analogy. If I stood in front of a curtain and I stood in front of the most important decision makers in the world, and I said, behind this curtain, I've got this Canadian machine that can sequester 40 million tons of carbon a year. That's the potential of this machine. The investment would flow. Hundreds of millions of dollars would flow to my machine. And if I pull back the curtain and the machine is thousands of farmers with their hands in the dirt, sequestering carbon and providing all these other co-benefits that are beneficial to all Canadians. This is a remarkable story. We have never framed it that way. We've got this great machine and we're investing a lot of money, rightly so, in carbon capture technology around the globe. We've got a pretty good technology ourselves. It's called human beings. And they've got a pretty good tool. It's called land. And so I think that's, if I frame it that way, it becomes sort of a slightly different conversation.
And so Jen, how do you see this conversation playing out, right? So people I think again a lot of people would inherently know kind of what the point that Bryan's making, but we sometimes have lost track of it. I think that there's probably some issues on both kind of how government framed what it was trying to do and how the industry then reacted to what government was trying to do in the specific fertilizer case. But you've been in government, you've done work in industry associations. How do you see kind of the two sides of that coin, and how you get to a middle ground where, from a policy perspective, we're getting better outcomes because there's more of a common understanding of what the true cost or the true benefit of agriculture's impacts are?
Well, I guess maybe as an individual, I'm not a representative of government. I would say that generally speaking, Canada's pretty cautious about seizing our opportunities. You know, we didn't come out strong for biofuel early on. We lost out to California, basically. We have had lots of opportunities to make inroads in innovation that we have not captured. I think some of it is the tentative nature of our policy response. You know, we love pilot projects, but we don't love big ideas so much. And I think that over time, we do make some of those changes, and we do eventually when you have a very clear goal ahead of you, I think we get serious, but lots of the opportunities at the beginning of this process were just ideas. And I think that's in the nature of Canadian policy, that we like to start small. We
Well,
want to be sure about what we're sure about when we decide to tackle something.
you know, and south of the border, they don't seem to have that concern, right?
They
You know,
do not at all.
they're prepared to go big, and so
Yes.
it's been interesting to watch what's called the Inflation Reduction Act, but ends up being a significant investment in green industrial policy in the United States that's going to have a big impact, that's going to enable a lot of positive incentives to be paid to farmers to improve their sustainability. It's a bit of a natural experiment where, you know, they've gone all in on those carrots, and in Canada we've got kind of, as you say, this cautious blend of a little bit of everything. You know, I just maybe go to Tristan in a minute, but Jan, like, do you think that just comes from the different nature of our approach to policymaking in Canada, where we're not prepared to go all in the way that the Americans are on this?
Yeah, I think Canadians are incrementalists for sure. I think ag policy has been a perfect example of that. We haven't had very many revolutions in agricultural policy over the years. Everything's been built on things in the past. We just don't seem to be as gung-ho as the US, and we're not a very risk-taking culture, especially in agriculture. And there are lots of reasons for that. I mean, some of it is that, you know, the industry doesn't like change. I don't like change. You know, I still have a iPhone 6. Sorry. But I think that's part of the culture. Part of it is our system of how we move forward with policy changes. I mean, the last big revolution in anything economic in Canada was really what? The US Free Trade Agreement and the GST. That's a long time ago. So,
well, and so Tristan, what's we talk about putting values on things. How do you put a value on the impact of that cautiousness and what it might mean? Again, look at the case of an ag and environment policy today. How do you see that playing out?
You know, Tyler, a lot of your questions have been easy and fun to answer. That is not that's a tough one. You know, what's the price of being cautious? Oh man. I will defer to my other panelists about historical aspects of Canadian policy and their reticence. But one big exception I can see to that is with respect to carbon pricing. You know, by 2030, Canada's federally applied backstop carbon price of $170 per ton is somewhat of an outlier in the developed world. So that's, I mean, granted, it doesn't really cover the ag sector like at all, but you know, perhaps we can talk about that later. You know, there are definitely merits to both approaches in terms of being risk averse versus more conservative. But I would argue that some of these externalities that we're discussing will require approaches that are less conservative, especially when we think about the research around the idea of climate tipping points, that if we go beyond a certain concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, we will get to this point from which we cannot return. And that's that is a fact that does not sit well with conservatism.
And so carrying on with questions that are probably maybe a little bit more challenging, I'm going to ask Margaret this one first, and then we'll go around and ask everyone the same. But if you look at you know, Jan says we don't do revolution very well. Margaret, where do you see the greatest opportunity for revolution in ag policy in this space?
Well, yes, that's a pretty big question. um, Given we're a cautious society here, but I think that there's nothing like necessity, which drives invention. And if you start as Tristan mentioned, facing adversity, if we start really seeing pressures on, like Southern Ontario, I don't know, they keep building, spreading. Is there going to be land left, that fine agriculture land in the Golden Triangle? And then you're going to run into water issues, lack of, even prices going up because of food eventually. So it's these, where the revolution will be. Well, there's already some things we know are going on in genetics, genomics, and new approaches to farming and things like that. And so, but I think it has to be driven by the adversity or the real shocks. Otherwise, as Jan says, we're too cautious, and we kind of this incremental approach where, okay, we'll just invest a little bit more here because of that. But I agree that $170 price of carbon is really quite significant compared to other countries. But we're not there yet. But yeah, when that happens, and they're saying it's going to be $170 a ton. So anyway,
I think Margaret's point is a good one here if we get there.
Right.
And I would just point out that in agriculture, one of the things we have done to get big policy changes is to exempt agriculture from most of it. We exempted them from the GST. We've exempted them from a lot of the trade agreements, and we're probably going to do that for carbon pricing as well. So I think, the agriculture industry as a whole has to really take that on board. I mean, do we want to be the laggards in this, or do we want to take advantage of the opportunities that are clearly there that Bryan has outlined? And so our tendency has been to leave agriculture alone because it's hard to do, and focus on all the other industries. And that looks like, to me, what we're doing right now.
And so, Jan, if we weren't going to do that, if we were going to move past an incremental approach, where do you think the opportunities are for more significant policy change?
Well, I think there are lots of opportunities in terms of coherent policy. And by that, I mean making sure that we don't have incentives and disincentives. We still have marked fuel. We are now discussing whether or not we exempt grain dryers from the carbon tax, and we have already exempted fuel from the carbon tax. Some of Margaret's data there shows that we haven't made very much progress on air pollutants, particulate matter, and ammonia being two cases in point. We still have not done well on that score. We're doing better in some areas, like the areas like ALUS in biodiversity. Perhaps we're doing a little bit better. And we certainly have done a lot more research and understand the problem a lot better. But yeah, there's lots of opportunity to improve our business risk management programs. I mean, those are our huge programs, and we have disincentives in there in terms of rules on how you administer crop insurance. There's no opportunity for differential premiums for people who put in place, environmental benefits. So, the automobile industry has really done tons in that regard in terms of safe driving records and reducing your premiums if you're a safe driver. But we stick with the same premiums for everybody, no matter what they do in crop insurance. There are conflicting policies in all of our big policies, and we seem to want to layer on new programs instead of making big changes in those. Once again, I think there are pilots in place to do that, but we don't want to tamper too much with the status quo. We just want to make small changes, and that's worked for us so far. But I mean, if we have goals and targets in the next 10 years, that's going to be difficult.
So Jan, it says something that one of the most revolutionary things we could do is have coherent policies in this country. That's a lot about the current landscape.
Well, we're not alone in that. I mean, every developed country in the world has problems like that as well. But
right.
So,
and,
to
and
be
so,
fair.
So Bryan, where do you see the opportunity to move past incrementalism and do something bigger or bolder from a policy perspective?
I'm first going to start by saying this is the end of December's year 18 for me on this file. I felt like I began pushing a rock up a hill, and now the hill's steeper and the rock's bigger, but we'll set that aside for a minute. I think reframe this. Listen, we've had the benefit of listening to farmers and ranchers across the country on their willingness to participate in this space. And these are the terms, right? And that's what we've unearthed. We've unearthed a program that gets at that. And what it hinges on is a really simple, fundamental thing that's attractive to every government in every part of the world, and that is productivity, right? If we look at this particular activity as, I know it's environmental in nature, but if we look at it as economic activity, and that there's a marketplace that we're servicing, my God, $170 a ton, that's a marketplace. And layer over that, if you assume that, as I do, because I'm really simple, that governments spend money in these spaces on biodiversity, on water quality, on the nature-based solutions fund, that they're purchasing things on behalf of Canadians. They're purchasing these services, or however we want to frame it. But if you put it in a market lens, that's an energy too, that's coming our way. So let's reframe it. The farmers love the notion that they're producing something in addition, that they're productive people and they're still producing things, and it's a good place, not a bad place. And it can be framed in the market signals that they're used to dealing with. When we wrap our brains around the fact that that is productive economic activity that has a tremendous amount of benefits for all Canadians, it gets a little exciting. It gets us out of that sort of safe space. It gets us into some economic development. And we've already talked about the layering for Brand Canada for our farm products, right? The impacts on natural infrastructure cost savings for our municipalities and our communities. All these things can layer in. Anyways, that's where I think the logjam will break, is when we begin to see things that way. There's been a lot of work on that front. There's really cool places like Gibson's, BC, that have done these sorts of things. I know our municipal partners ourselves have done some of these things or adopted this viewpoint. I think that's what's going to do it.
Great. And so Tristan, I'll give you the opportunity to talk about where you see the opportunity to go beyond incrementalism. And I'm going to add in a question that's come in through the Q&A that talks about, one of the biggest negative externalities from our agriculture system, it comes on the food end, where we have an unhealthy Western diet. And so we talk a lot about the externalities on the agriculture side of agriculture and food. Was wondering if, once you talk about opportunities to go beyond incrementalism, if you could also talk about what does that externality on that consumption end look like, and how do we bake that into the agriculture and food policy discussion?
Sure. I was looking at that question too, and I was wondering what to do about that, because it's such a tough one. I was debating about typing it, but we can talk about it. So just to also clarify, we have 10 minutes left.
That's right. Yes.
Okay, I'll be quick. With respect to moving away from incrementalism, I wanted to talk a little bit about something that Margaret said and something that Jan said. Something that Margaret said that's very prescient is that, sometimes we need severity to kick us into action. One of the issues with the GHG externality is that by the time we see severity, especially in Canada, it'll be too late, which makes it very difficult. And some people say that that's why it's such a quote unquote wicked problem. And then to Jan's point about the insurance, I would say that differential premiums do exist, but they are not used to combat negative externalities or improve positive externalities, which a lot of people see as a potential foregone opportunity. Interestingly, there is one exception to that, which was when Alberta was dealing with clubroot issues that came from growing canola on canola without a break. And in that case, insurance stepped in and said, hey, you know what? We are not going to insure people that do this because it's going to spread clubroot. Why was Alberta Insurance so willing to do that? Because the damage was visible and it happened locally, right? But so far, there is an unwillingness for federal or provincial ag policy to address things that are global issues with respect to externalities anyway. So I do think there's things we could do there. And as far as going away from incrementalism, if we are going to have a carbon tax in Canada, if we are going to say that our goal is to try and reduce emissions by, we want to reduce 40% of 2005 levels, or I think they just bumped it up to possibly 45%. It's in society's interest to do that at the lowest cost possible. We don't want to hurt agricultural productivity because that's a huge driver for so many provinces. But at the same time, we want to make sure that every ton of GHG abated is at the lowest possible cost that we can do that. There are opportunities to do that in agriculture that are going to be completely lost because the bulk of agricultural GHG emissions are not covered by the carbon tax, which is a problem in that the incentives to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in agriculture in non-energy ways are basically gone unless the farmer realizes that in doing that, they will also get a co-benefit, which is zero till, right? But there's a lot of other things that doesn't have the same co-benefit as zero till that would still represent a low cost way to reduce society's greenhouse gas emissions. So to step away from incrementalism, I would like to see Canada take a more comprehensive approach, I would say, to dealing with those issues in agriculture, rather than just the laissez-faire. I'm not going to upset that apple cart, so to speak. To the question about the food system, saying that is a negative externality. Academically, I would not call that a negative externality in most cases, right? In the case where a consumer has the opportunity to pick between different types of food and is not just subject to this quote unquote Western diet, then I would say that is a conscious decision made by the consumer that operating in a marketplace with a certain willingness to pay for foods that consist of that Western diet. And he or she is saying, that's what I prefer relative to these other options. However, that said, there are lots of places now where the Western diet is the only option. And it's the only option that is time efficient to prepare or within their budget, right? And in that case, is that a negative externality? That's a big debate. That's a big debate.
Yeah. And so in the 5 minutes that are left, I'm going to ask a simple question, and we'll see if anybody wants to volunteer to ask it. But there was a question in the Q&A about border carbon adjustments, and they were, I think it opens up an interesting window that we probably could spend an hour talking about just in and of itself. But in an export-dependent sector where the majority of most of what we produce in agriculture leaves our borders and goes somewhere else, how do we effectively manage externalities in a competitive global environment? Who would like to take that one on? Tristan, you're nodding along. I'll maybe go back to you first.
Sure, I'll go quickly so that my fellow panelists can weigh in as well. This is a very interesting issue. My colleague William Kerr at the University of Saskatchewan is very interested in this issue, with the idea that if we do not have a carbon price on our agricultural production, that we would be sort of dinged for it and when trying to export. Now, I don't really see the potential for that in the near future, partially because we don't have any indication that other countries are going to subject their own ag sectors to this type of carbon policy. So I do think it's something to look at, especially especially for exports that are going to developed countries that are taking climate policy more seriously. But with respect to developing countries, I don't see that as being as salient of an issue, but it could be used in the context of trade disagreements as sort of a non-tariff barrier to say, we're trying to protect our burgeoning corn industry, so we don't want to take your high GHG corn, or whatever the case may be. And I'm not trying to make comparisons about GHG emissions across countries, because I know Canada is very strong in that area, but that's how I see it.
Jan, how does this play out from a, when government's thinking about policy, how do we deal with domestic externalities in a global marketplace?
Well, I don't think I can much improve on what Tristan said. I think we are seeing some of that in the biofuel market. So I think we know that it is a real issue in terms of developed countries. Again, I think I go back to some of the things that Bryan has been talking about in terms of how we see it as an opportunity instead of, some barrier to be managed. So again, it's a question of, how could we turn that into some kind of an opportunity for us by being, sustainable producers of products and preferred suppliers.
Yeah.
I don't know the extent to which we are down that road yet, but it's certainly an interesting idea.
And so Bryan, just quickly from you, maybe, how do you see ALUS and the work that you're doing helping improve competitive position of Canadian producers in export markets?
There's two things. There's the perhaps biggest thing I spoke about earlier, and there's been some talk about it. Brand Canada counts. It matters. I remember seeing an old picture of the first Weston Bakery, and I remember that the sign on the awning said, "We use the finest Manitoba wheat." Right? There's something to that we can accrue these benefits to Brand Canada and globally get preferential treatment in these places. That's how I see it can benefit. It helps. I think individual farmers that are participating in our program, I think are using it well to be able to communicate the benefits of, well, I buy mine instead of buy yours. So I think that's again an opportunity. Branding is a big question, but it's a great opportunity if we're making it real and accountable and we're doing the things that we say we're doing. And I think in Canada we've got the biggest opportunity to do so.
Great, thank you. And Margaret, we started with you. We'll end with you. Last words on how you see this playing out in that international context.
What percentage of our agriculture production is exported? And those sectors that do export, I don't know, like some of them are pretty low carbon intensive as it is. And I agree with Tristan. I am not sure it's going to be implemented. Yeah, an opportunity because, in certain areas, Canada has done well and is doing well and heading in the right direction in terms of competitiveness on this front.
Well, and I think heading in the right direction is a good note to end on, and Canada has certainly made progress. Tristan's report from 2020 highlighted it. The work that Bryan and others are doing right now kind of just reinforces that significant change that Canada's making. I'd like to really thank the panelists for the discussion today. I think that this is one of these fundamental issues around policy development that really underpins a lot of what we talk about, but sometimes we don't do a good enough job talking about really the basics of it, as Margaret says, going back to some of these economic 101 courses that can hopefully help recenter the debate. Thank you again, panelists. This recording will be available up on YouTube. Please, once it goes out, share it around. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a great day, and we look forward to seeing you at the next CAPI webinar.